They say deep-sea pressure can crush a submarine like a soda can. They're wrong. The pressure that breaks you isn't outside. It's the one that replaces your memories with its own. I went down searching for a wreck. I wish it had found me first, because now, when I close my eyes, I see through 1,000 other eyes that drowned in this same silent dark. The hum is the first thing you forget to notice, and the last thing you hear when the silence gets too loud. It's the sound of life support, the constant thrum of the carbon dioxide scrubbers, the faint whine of the electrical systems, the mechanical heartbeat of the Triton. For a deep-sea saturation diver like me, that hum is the soundtrack to my life, the white noise that separates me from the crushing absolute zero of the abyss. My name is Alex, and for the last 8 years, this steel tube has been more of a home to me than any place on the surface. Our current mission was standard procedure, wrapped in a thick blanket of corporate cash and non-disclosure agreements. A high-paying, anonymous client hired us for a simple salvage operation in the Northern Atlantic, deep within a trench that charts simply labeled unexplored. The target, a data vault from a prototype cargo vessel, the Hyperion, which had supposedly gone down in a storm. The pay was obscene, enough for our captain Marcus to retire, for our sonar tech, Lena, to fund her own research for a decade, and for me to finally buy that house on the coast I'd been promising my wife. The kind of money that makes you stop asking questions. Life inside the submersible was a practiced rhythm of routine. We were a 3-person crew, a perfect triangle of functionality. Marcus was the rock, a former Navy man with a face carved from granite, and a voice that never rose above a calm, authoritative monotone. He navigated the crushing darkness with the casual focus of a man driving to the grocery store. Lena was the brain, a prodigy fresh out of MIT who could read a sonar display like a composer reads sheet music. She saw the world in frequencies and wavelengths, her fingers dancing across her console, translating the whispers of the deep into a coherent map. And me, I was the hands, the guy who would put on the atmospheric diving suit, step out into a world of impossible pressure, and do the work. 200 meters to the target coordinates, Alex. Marcus's voice crackled through the small cabin, pulling me from my thoughts. Start your pre-breather checks. I want you ready to deploy the ROV the moment we have visual. Copy that, Captain, I replied, my eyes scanning the gauges of the small remote-operated vehicle tethered in the deployment bay. The Triton wasn't large. A cramped cockpit, a small galley, and a tiny bunk area were all we had. Every inch was designed for function, packed with wires, monitors, and pipes. The air had the constant, sterile tang of ozone and recycled oxygen. It was a self-contained world, a tiny bubble of warmth and life, adrift in an alien planet hidden on our own. Anything on sonar, Lena? Marcus asked, his gaze fixed on the forward viewport, which showed nothing but an impenetrable curtain of black, occasionally pierced by the bioluminescence of some passing, ghostly creature. Lena was leaning forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. The soft green glow of her main screen illuminated her face. Negative, Captain. Bottom topography matches the client's charts, but there's nothing there. No debris field, no wreckage. The Hyperion should be right on top of us. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. A ship that size doesn't just vanish. It leaves a scar, a trail of twisted metal and spilled cargo. Could the currents have moved it? I asked, looking over at her station. Not at this depth, she said, shaking her head, and not this far. We're talking about thousands of tons of steel. It should be a mountain on my screen. Right now, all I have is mud. Marcus was unfazed. Run the wide spectrum scan. The client's data could be old. It might have broken up on the way down. Lena's fingers flew across the keyboard. The low-frequency pulse of the deep sonar emitted a soft ping that resonated through the hull. We waited. The return data began to paint a picture on her screen, line by painstaking line. The seabed remained flat, featureless. Then something appeared. A flicker. Wait, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. I have something, but it's not the Hyperion. What is it? Marcus asked, his tone sharpening. I don't know, she replied, her voice a mixture of confusion and awe. The coordinates are off by about half a kilometer to the east, and it's massive, far larger than the target vessel. But the sonar return is all wrong. It's like it's absorbing the signal. It's a hole, a void on the map. Marcus steered the Triton slowly, cautiously, toward the new coordinates. The mood in the cabin shifted. The comfortable boredom of routine was gone, replaced by a tense electric curiosity. This was what we lived for, the discovery of the unknown. We were modern-day explorers, charting the last true frontier on Earth. Bringing the forward floodlights to maximum, Marcus announced. Two powerful beams of white light stabbed into the darkness, cutting through the eternal night. At first, we saw nothing but floating particulate, the deep-sea snow that constantly drifts down from the world above. Then a shape began to resolve itself from the gloom. It wasn't a ship. It was immense, a monolith of impossible geometry resting silently on the ocean floor. Its structure was all sharp, unnatural angles and sweeping organic curves that seemed to contradict each other. The hull, if you could call it that, was made of a material blacker than the abyss itself, a matte substance that seemed to swallow the beams of our floodlights, reflecting almost nothing. There was no rust, no corrosion, not a single barnacle or strand of sea life clinging to its surface. In a place where life fights to colonize every available surface, it was unnervingly, sterilely clean. It looked less like it had sunk and more like it had been placed there moments ago, yet it radiated an aura of immense ancient age. "My God," I breathed, pressing my face closer to the thick acrylic of the viewport. "What is that?" "Military stealth prototype, some kind of fallen satellite," Marcus speculated, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trying to fit this impossible object into a known category, and it wouldn't go. "The material doesn't conform to any known alloy," Lena said, her eyes wide, glued to her sensor readings. "Thermal is reading absolute zero, which is impossible. It should be the same temperature as the surrounding water. It's like it's not even part of this environment." A deep, primal part of my brain was screaming at me, a part that evolved to recognize predators, to fear the dark, to understand when something was profoundly wrong. This object felt wrong on a fundamental level. It didn't belong in the ocean. It didn't belong on Earth. "I'm deploying the ROV," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need a closer look." Marcus nodded, his eyes still locked on the colossal shape outside. "Take it slow, Alex. Keep your distance until we know what we're dealing with." I maneuvered the small drone from its bay, its own small light adding a tiny pinprick against the vast, dark structure. The controls felt slick with sweat in my hands. I piloted it forward, the fiber optic cable spooling out behind it, our only link to the small machine. On my main monitor, the camera feed gave us a clear, high-definition view. As the ROV drew closer, the sheer scale of the thing became overwhelming. It was like flying alongside a fallen skyscraper. There were no windows, no doors, no markings, no signs of propulsion, just the silent, light-devouring hull. That's when the sound started. It came through the hydrophone feed from the ROV, a faint static at first. "Interference?" Marcus asked. "Shouldn't be," Lena replied, already adjusting her filters. "The cable is shielded." The static grew, resolving itself not into machine noise, but into a low, resonant hum. It was a deep, guttural vibration that I felt in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. It sounded organic, like the slow, sleeping breath of a creature the size of a mountain. "What is that sound?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lena was frantically working at her console. "I can't isolate the source. It's everywhere. It's not just on the hydrophone. The frequency is resonating through our own hull now." And then it happened. For a single horrifying frame, the video feed from the ROV blinked. It flickered, but instead of static, it showed us something else. It wasn't the black hull of the strange wreck. It was our cockpit, the cockpit of the Triton, but it was wrong. The image was dark, filmed from an angle just behind my chair. The control panels were rusted, crusted with decades of marine growth. The monitors were shattered, slick with a thick layer of green-brown algae. My own chair, Marcus's, Lena's, they were empty, torn and decaying. It was a tomb, a wreck, our wreck, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, the image was gone. The feed snapped back to the silent black hull outside. Then the feed went dead. My monitor displayed nothing but blackness and the words "signal lost." The deep, breathing hum cut out. The only sound left was the familiar, steady thrum of the Triton's life support, but it offered no comfort. The silence that filled our small cabin was more terrifying than any sound. We stared at the dead screen. The impossible, ghostly image of our own derelict future burned into our minds. We were thousands of meters beneath the surface, floating next to a thing that defied all known laws of physics, a thing that had just shown us a vision of our own grave. My initial mission was to salvage a data vault, but now, trapped in the crushing dark with this ancient, impossible thing, I understood that our real mission had just begun. Survival. If you've ever felt the universe peel back its skin and show you something you were never meant to see, you know exactly how we felt in that moment. If you want to descend deeper into this abyss with us, subscribe and leave a like on this video. Because what came next proved that our mission had changed from salvage to something much, much darker. The silence that flooded the cockpit in the wake of the ROV's demise was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a thick, viscous thing that clogged our ears and coated our lungs, heavy with the weight of the impossible image we had just witnessed. For a lifetime that lasted perhaps 60 seconds, the only movement was the frantic dance of my own pulse against the inside of my skull. The familiar hum of the Triton's life support systems, the mechanical heartbeat that had been my constant companion for years, now sounded fragile, a pathetic flutter against the crushing, listening stillness that pressed in from the other side of the hull. I stared at the blank monitor, but I wasn't seeing its dead screen. I was seeing our cockpit, drowned and decayed, a silent testament to a future that had already happened. Marcus was the first to break the spell. He moved with a stiff marionette-like motion, his face a mask of hardened denial. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low rasp that scraped the air. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They darted from Lena's console to the viewport and back again, unable to rest on the terrifying black shape that loomed outside. He was searching for an anchor, a piece of the logical world he understood, and finding none. "The tether. It's gone." Lena's voice was a tremulous whisper, but her fingers were already moving across her keyboard with a frantic precision. Diagnostics scrolled across her screen in streams of green text. "The fiber optic cable isn't just unresponsive, it's severed. A clean break. No telemetry, no video, no power link. The ROV is a ghost." "A clean break? At this depth? By what?" I demanded, the words tumbling out of me. I pushed myself out of my chair, the metallic tang of fear sharp on my tongue. "And the image, Marcus, the flicker? We all saw it. That was our cockpit, our graves." "Pressure psychosis," Marcus snapped, the words coming out like machine gun fire. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at Lena. He was addressing the entity itself, daring it to break through his wall of disbelief. High-stress environment. Nitrogen saturation at these depths can induce vivid, shared hallucinations. It's a documented phenomenon. We saw a corrupted data packet, a digital ghost. The cable snagged on the wreck and snapped. It's the only logical explanation. "With all due respect, Captain, that is not a logical explanation." Lena's voice cut through his denial with the sharp edge of scientific certainty. Her fear was being channeled into pure, cold analysis. It was her defense mechanism. The data packet was not corrupted. For a duration of 27 milliseconds, the ROV transmitted a perfect, uncompressed 8K video stream. I've isolated the raw data. The image showed this exact space, down to the scuff mark on your console and the coffee stain near my keyboard. The level of detail, the contextual coherence, the statistical probability of a random glitch generating that specific image is less than 1 in a trillion. It's an impossibility. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a message. A message from what? A talking shipwreck? Marcus's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound that held no humor, only desperation. "We are a professional salvage crew, not characters in a cheap sci-fi novel. The mission is compromised. The primary objective is lost. We are ascending." He finally turned, his hand reaching for the ballast controls, a man forcing his will upon a reality that was actively unraveling around him. His fingers were millimeters from the panel when the comm system, silent for the entire descent, crackled to life with a burst of violent static. It was a sound so unexpected, so intrusive, that all three of us flinched as if from a physical blow. A disembodied voice, shredded and distorted by what sounded like an ocean of electronic noise, clawed its way into the cockpit. Triton, this is surface control. A report to your status immediately. Marcus, visibly relieved to be on familiar ground, thumbed the transmitter. Control, this is Triton. We've made contact with an uncharted, unidentified object at the target coordinates. It is not the Hyperion. Our ROV has been destroyed during initial reconnaissance. Repeat, our ROV is lost. We are aborting the mission and returning to base. A long, pregnant pause followed, filled only by the agonizing hiss and pop of the static. It felt as if our words were traveling across light years, not a few miles of water. Then the voice returned, colder and clearer than before, as if the entity on the other end had made a conscious effort to focus its will. Negative, Triton. Aborting is not an option. Your contractual obligations are clear. The client insists you continue the investigation of this new objective. Insists. I couldn't stop myself. Our equipment was just destroyed. We have no idea what that thing is. We saw... The client is aware of the increased risk, the voice interrupted, its tone chillingly indifferent. A substantial hazard bonus has been authorized for each member of the crew, effective immediately. 5 times your original fee. The sum is non-negotiable. Proceed with a close-range sensory pass. Document the object's composition and configuration. Acknowledge, Triton. 5 times. The number hung in the air, a beautiful, poisonous lure. It was a sum that didn't just buy houses, it bought new lives, erased debts, and fulfilled dreams. It was also, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, a price. A price for our silence, a price for our lives. They knew something was down here. This wasn't a salvage job, it was a suicide mission with a golden parachute that would only be paid to our next of kin. Control, you don't understand what's happening down here, Marcus argued, his voice strained. This isn't just a wreck, it's... He trailed off, unable to articulate the sheer wrongness of what we were facing. We understand perfectly, Captain. That is why the offer is so generous. Acknowledge the order. The voice was no longer a request. It was a steel trap closing around us. The line went dead, fading into a final, long hiss that felt unnervingly like a sigh. We were cut off, adrift, trapped between a monster in the deep and the faceless corporate machine that had sent us to it. Marcus stood motionless for a long time, his back to us. I could see the battle raging within him, the ingrained discipline of a soldier, the pragmatism of a captain, and the raw primal fear of a man staring into the void. The lure of the money won. It always does. "Lena," he said, his voice a low growl, devoid of its earlier bravado. "Bring the short-range passive sensors online. Full spectrum. I want to know what this thing is made of. Alex, run a constant diagnostic on the hull integrity. I want to know if this thing so much as breathes on us. We'll do one slow, wide pass. We get their data, we take their money, and we get the hell out of here." His words were meant to reassure, to re-establish the chain of command, but they felt hollow. We were insects crawling along the hide of a sleeping god, pretending we were in control. As Marcus engaged the thrusters, the Triton began to creep forward, its lights cutting a pathetic swathe through the oppressive black. The structure filled the viewport again, a monument to a reality governed by different, older laws. The closer we got, the more my mind struggled to process its form. The angles were too sharp, the curves too perfect. It was like staring at a fourth-dimensional object casting a three-dimensional shadow. And that's when the vibration began. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling that started in the deepest parts of my bones. A low-frequency thrumming that resonated up through the floor plates and into the very core of my being. It was a subliminal hum, a bass note played on an instrument the size of a planet. It harmonized perfectly with the Triton's own operational frequencies, masking itself, integrating itself into our environment like a virus invading a cell. "Lena, what is that?" I asked, my hand pressed against the vibrating viewport. She was already working, her face illuminated by the eerie green light of her console. "It's a resonance," she murmured, her eyes wide with a terrifying, academic curiosity. "The frequency is... it's not stable. It's chaotic, but it has a pattern, like a fractal. It's almost alive." She pointed a trembling finger at a waveform spiraling on her screen. And it's not coming from outside anymore. The source isn't external. The sensor array is showing the epicenter is our own hull. The metal itself is vibrating, it's singing. The thrum intensified, rising from a subliminal feeling into an audible, gut-wrenching sound. It was the same deep, rhythmic breathing we had heard through the ROV's hydrophone. But it wasn't a recording anymore, it was live, it was here. It was the sound of our steel cage coming alive, the slow and steady inhalation and exhalation of a leviathan whose lungs were the very walls meant to protect us. The air grew heavy, charged with a static I could feel on my skin. And then, woven into the deep rhythmic breathing, came the whispers. They were insidious, starting as faint, sibilant threads of sound that coiled at the edge of my hearing. I thought it was the machinery, the hiss of the air scrubbers, my own mind finally cracking. But then I saw Lena's head tilt, her brow furrowing. I saw Marcus's knuckles turn white as he gripped the helm, a tiny muscle in his jaw twitching uncontrollably. We all heard it. The thing was trying to speak, and then it learned our names. A voice as soft and familiar as a half-remembered dream bloomed not in my ears, but directly in the center of my skull. It was a violation of the most intimate kind, a trespasser in the sanctuary of my own consciousness. "Alex? Honey, is that you?" I was so worried. It's so dark down there. It was Sarah, my wife. Her voice was perfect. Every subtle inflection, every nuance of warmth, every shade of love that I had committed to memory over 15 years. The sound of it, the feel of it in my head, was a simultaneous rush of profound comfort and absolute, soul-freezing terror. "Why did you leave? You promised you'd be back for our anniversary." "I'm all alone up here, Alex." "Stop it," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut, as if that could make it go away. My mind was a battlefield. One part, the logical part, screamed that this was a trick, a mimicry. But the other part, the part that loved her, that missed her with an ache that was a physical pain, that part wanted to answer. It knew things. "Remember that little cafe in Marseille? The one where you proposed? You were so nervous you spilled wine all over your shirt. You still have that shirt, don't you? In the back of the closet." It was plundering my mind, pulling out my most private, cherished memories and dangling them in front of me like bait. It was defiling them, turning them into weapons. I risked a glance at Lena. Her face was a mask of haunted anguish. Silent tears traced paths down her cheeks as she stared at nothing. Her lips were moving, forming silent words. A new sound had joined the chorus, a faint, tinny melody. It was a lullaby, simple and sweet, the kind a mother would sing to her child, but the notes were slightly off, bent and warped into a discordant, mournful dirge. The melody soured, stretching and decaying, corrupting a memory of love into an anthem of loss. "She's singing it wrong," Lena whimpered, her hands covering her ears, a futile gesture against a sound that was already inside. "That's not how she sings it." I looked to Marcus for some semblance of command, of control. He was a statue, his eyes fixed on the viewport, on the abyss, but sweat was pouring down his temples. "Captain?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. "There is nothing there," he roared, slamming his fist against the console. The outburst was so violent, so out of character, it made me recoil. "It is the pressure, the isolation. The mind creates ghosts to fill the silence. We will not break. Do you hear me? We will not break." His denial was a prayer to a god that had long since abandoned this part of the ocean. He was hearing his own ghosts, his own private devils, and his only defense was to scream them into non-existence. The entity knew. It knew his pride was his fortress, and it was laying siege to it with whispers I could not hear, but whose effects I could see as clearly as the cracks forming in his sanity. In an act of sheer, desperate rebellion, Lena threw herself at her console. Her face was a mess of tears and fierce determination. "I am a scientist," she declared to the whispering darkness, "and this is an observable phenomenon. If it's a signal, it has properties. It can be measured, it can be isolated, and it can be amplified." "Lena, no!" I shouted, a spike of pure instinctual dread lancing through me. "Don't engage with it. That's what it wants." "It's already engaging with us," she fired back, her fingers flying across her control panel, bypassing safety protocols and rerouting audio feeds. "It's in our heads, Alex. I am not going to be a passive observer in my own violation." She slammed a final key. She had routed the core frequency of the whispers, the anomalous biological signal, directly into the main cockpit speakers, overriding every limiter. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the sound erupted. It was a physical assault, a deafening roar composed of the deep, resonant breathing and 1,000 overlapping whispers. The entire submarine screamed. The lights flickered, and I felt the deck plates vibrating so violently I thought they would tear apart. And then, from within the hurricane of noise, a single voice emerged. It was not one voice, but a legion speaking in perfect, chilling unison. It was ancient, genderless, and utterly alien. It silenced the chaos, and with the pristine clarity of a shattered crystal, it spoke a single question that echoed not in the air, but in the marrow of our bones. "What do you love the most?" The final syllable of that impossible question had not yet faded when the Triton itself gave its answer. A symphony of alarms shrieked to life at once. Every screen flashed a violent, pulsing red. The main lights died, plunging us into a nightmarish, strobing, crimson emergency lighting. And through the chaos, the calm, synthesized voice of the ship's computer began its litany of doom. Warning: life support systems failure. Catastrophic oxygen imbalance detected. Warning: carbon dioxide. Scrubbers offline. Warning. The steady, comforting hum of our air supply cut out with a final, pathetic whine. The silence it left behind was absolute. The air in the cockpit instantly felt thick, heavy, and sickeningly finite. We were in a sealed coffin, thousands of meters beneath the waves, next to a thing that had intimately learned our deepest affections and had just, with casual, effortless precision, begun to suffocate us. The alarms were not silenced. They were executed. In one moment, the Triton was a screaming chamber of synthesized panic, a strobing crimson abattoir, where the very air was a countdown to our suffocation. In the next, a silence so profound, so utterly complete, slammed down upon us. It was not a cessation of noise, but a tangible void, a black hole that consumed sound and left a ringing metallic vacancy in its wake. The emergency lights didn't fade. They were extinguished, plunging us into a disorienting absolute blackness that lasted for 3 eternal heartbeats. Then, with the hesitant buzz of a reluctant machine, the standard, sterile white operational lighting flickered back into existence, revealing a scene frozen in terror. And then, the sound. The gentle, almost apologetic hum of the carbon dioxide scrubbers spinning back to life. A soft pneumatic hiss as the oxygen regulators resumed their gentle rhythm. Life support had returned. We were, for the moment, permitted to live. No one spoke. No one dared. We were 3 figures locked in a tableau of aftermath, each processing the brutal, intimate demonstration of power we had just endured. The air, which moments ago had been a thick, finite poison, now flowed cool and clean into my desperate lungs. Yet each inhalation felt like a transgression, a sip of air borrowed from a capricious god who could revoke the privilege at any moment. My own breathing was a ragged, wet storm in the renewed quiet. I could feel the violent tremor in my hands, a frantic energy with nowhere to go. This was not a system failure. Malfunctions are chaotic, indiscriminate. This was a scalpel. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to strip away our sense of security and replace it with the suffocating certainty of our own helplessness. We were not a crew in a submersible. We were specimens under a microscope, and the eye staring down at us was ancient, patient, and utterly without mercy. The fragile, unspoken bond of trust that keeps a deep-sea crew from turning on each other, that delicate ecosystem of shared risk and mutual reliance, did not just break, it detonated. The silence was the shockwave, and paranoia was the shrapnel. Marcus was the first to move, shoving himself away from the helm with a choked gasp, as if the controls themselves were contaminated. His face, washed in the cold, clinical glow of the reinstated console lights, was a horrifying mask of primal fear, barely contained by a lifetime of discipline. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, were not fixed on the viewport or his instruments. They were locked onto Lena. "What did you do?" he hissed, the words slithering out from between clenched teeth. He advanced on her, his heavy frame moving with a predator's coiled tension in the impossibly small space. "You couldn't leave it alone. You had to knock on the cage. You had to invite the damn thing in." Lena, who had been curled in on herself, her body still trembling from the oxygen deprivation, flinched at the venom in his tone, but a spark of defiance ignited in her eyes, burning through the fear. "Invited it in," she countered, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "It was already singing lullabies in my skull, Marcus. It was already showing Alex our graves. I was trying to understand the weapon being used against us. That is my job, to analyze the threat. Your job is to obey the captain," he roared, the sound exploding in the confined space. He slammed a massive fist down on the console beside her chair. The impact rattled the entire panel, and Lena recoiled as if struck. "My order was a passive, non-provocative scan. Your academic hubris, your need to poke and prod at things you don't understand, almost suffocated us. You are a child playing with a loaded gun." "And you're a liar!" she screamed back, surging to her feet, her smaller frame trembling but unbowed. The cockpit, our world, seemed to shrink around their volatile energy. This was never about the Hyperion, was it? That was a ghost story to get us down here. The real salvage, the real objective, was this. She gestured wildly at the viewport, at the colossal darkness that waited beyond. The corporation knew this was here. They sent us to make contact, didn't they? We're a lure. And you knew. You knew this was more than a salvage op. Her accusation hung in the air, thick and iridescent as an oil slick. It was a moment of absolute clarity. I watched Marcus, my own heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I saw him prepare a denial, saw his mouth open to deliver a blistering reprimand for her insubordination. But for a fraction of a second, his facade crumbled. A shadow passed behind his eyes, a flicker of guilt, of shared knowledge, of a terrible secret. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a mask of cold fury, but we had both seen it, and in that instant, we knew she was right. "You are compromised, Lena," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chillingly calm register. "Pressure-induced paranoia. You are officially relieved of your duties at this station. You will confine yourself to your bunk until I deem you fit to resume your post. That is a direct order." "You can't do that, and you know it. You need me to operate this sub," she protested, her voice cracking with disbelief. "I am the captain of this vessel," he stated, each word a hammer blow, rebuilding the wall of his authority. "My command is not a democracy. Now, both of you, stand down. We have a contract to fulfill. We will complete one final wide-arc sensor sweep. We will transmit the data, and then we will begin our ascent. The discussion is over." He turned his back on us, a clear act of dismissal, and strapped himself back into the pilot seat. He was a man trying to force the universe back into a shape he could comprehend, through sheer, brute force of will. But the spell was broken. He was no longer our captain. He was our handler, a man with a different set of loyalties. The true chain of command was no longer within the Triton. It was outside, emanating from that silent, black anomaly. We fractured into 3 islands of hostile silence. Marcus piloted with a rigid, unnatural focus. Lena returned to her seat, but she did not stand down. I could see the subtle movements of her fingers, the faint glow of diagnostic subroutines on her screen. She was not obeying. She was digging, searching for the truth he was hiding. And I was adrift. I was a spectator to our own quiet implosion, my mind a haunted gallery of impossible images, a derelict cockpit, a whaler's dying memory, my wife's voice calling to me from the abyss. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow, circular sweep of our sub around the colossal structure. The entity remained silent, content, it seemed, to watch the seeds of paranoia it had planted begin to sprout. An exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical illness began to settle into my bones. Eventually, I stumbled to my bunk, craving the temporary oblivion of sleep. But the entity had claimed that territory as well. I was on the deck of a great wooden ship, the timbers beneath my feet groaning in protest against a violent heaving sea. The air was a brutal cocktail of freezing salt spray and the rancid, cloying smell of rendered whale blubber. I was not myself. I was inhabiting another man's body, feeling the rough chafe of an oilskin coat against my neck, the unfamiliar weight of calloused, rope-scarred hands. I was a harpooner from Nantucket, sometime in the 1840s, and I was consumed by a terror that was not my own, but which I experienced with a horrifying, first-hand clarity. The sky was a bruised, sickly purple, and the sea was a frenzy of black, mountainous waves. But directly below us, the ocean was churning with a cold, phosphorescent light, an unholy emerald glow that pulsed from the depths. Then it surfaced. The black, angular monolith breached the waves with an impossible, silent grace, shedding waterfalls from its non-Euclidean surfaces. It absorbed the roar of the tempest, creating a pocket of unnatural stillness around it. I felt the collective, strangled scream of the crew, saw the raw animal panic in their eyes. A young cabin boy collapsed, shrieking and clawing at his face. The captain, a formidable man with a beard like a snowdrift, stood paralyzed at the ship's wheel, his mouth agape, his weathered face slack with a terror that transcended faith. And the whispers began, a symphony of torment woven into the howl of the wind. They were not in English, but in a tapestry of languages. Portuguese, Gaelic, Norwegian, the voices of a dozen different crews from a dozen different eras, all speaking at once, their words of love and loss and fear twisted into a single, sorrowful keen. I felt the consciousness I was wearing, the whaler's mind, begin to shred, to fray at the edges, his memories of home and hearth being overwritten by this alien signal. An aperture, a perfect circle of darkness dilated on the structure's hull, a silent invitation. The last sensation I felt before the vision shattered was an overwhelming, soul-crushing certainty of being recorded, of my entire existence being siphoned away into a silent, timeless archive. I awoke with a choked cry, thrashing in my narrow bunk, the thin mattress soaked through with a cold, terrified sweat. It wasn't a nightmare. It was an echo, a memory stored and replayed by the entity. I had just witnessed the final moments of another of its victims. This thing wasn't a predator in the conventional sense. It didn't just kill, it collected, it curated experiences. It was a librarian of extinction. Driven by a new, cold dread, I scrambled back into the cockpit. Marcus was slumped in his chair, caught in a fitful, twitching sleep, his face a landscape of torment. But Lena was awake. Her station was a pool of light in the dim cabin, and her eyes, when she turned them to me, burned with a feverish, almost manic intensity. She held a finger to her lips and beckoned me closer. "I found the source code for our damnation," she whispered, her voice a ragged, breathless thing. She pointed to a spiraling, hypnotic waveform on her screen, a pattern of exquisite, terrifying complexity. The resonance frequency. It's not just a signal, Alex. It's a key. It operates on a carrier wave that perfectly, precisely mirrors the bioelectrical frequency of the human hippocampus and temporal lobe. The very parts of the brain responsible for memory formation, emotional association, and sensory input. I stared at her, the technical jargon swimming in my sleep-deprived brain. "What does that mean?" "It means," she explained, her voice dropping even lower, "that this thing isn't playing head games. It's not supernatural. It's a biological hacker. It's performing a targeted wireless intrusion into the wetware of our brains. It reads our neural architecture, copies our memories, and then uses the same pathway to write its own data. The whispers, the visions, the voices. It's the most sophisticated form of psychological warfare imaginable. It turns the very fabric of who you are into a weapon against you." The truth of her words settled over me, cold and heavy as a shroud. Our minds were not our own. They were compromised territory. "And it gets worse," she continued, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "While Marcus was out, I ran a deep-level data recovery on the sub's auxiliary memory banks. I found a ghost partition, a whole section of the drive that was wiped and triple encrypted to hide its existence. It took me 3 hours to slice through the security." A new window populated on her screen. It was a list of file directories, each with a cryptic, mythological codename. Icarus, Expedition 1978. Orpheus Initiative 1989. Charon Probe 2003. Project Persephone 2011. Each one contained a full mission log. Each one detailed a different vessel, a different crew, sent to these exact coordinates under a different false pretext. Lena clicked on the final log entry from Project Persephone. The captain's text entries devolved from clinical professionalism into a frantic, disjointed chronicle of their descent into madness. Day 4. Auditory phenomena now persistent. Doctor. Aris claims it's a form of ultra-low-frequency infrasound affecting the inner ear. He says we are imagining the voices. Day 6. Aris is gone. He's barricaded himself in the medical bay. I can hear him through the door. He's humming. He says the hull is teaching him the melody of his own cellular decay. Day 8. We saw it today. God forgive us. It rose from the trench. It is not of this world. It wears the faces of our children in the viewport. It calls to us, promising release. Day 9. I hear my wife. She drowned 5 years ago. She is outside, scratching at the acrylic, asking me to let her in. Her voice is so cold, the water is so cold. The very last entry was a single corrupted fragment of text. The archive requires. The harvest is. The file ended there. We were just the latest offering. A routine delivery of fresh consciousness to a thing that had been feeding in this trench for God knows how long. I was still reeling from this, trying to absorb the sheer calculated evil of our employers, when every single monitor in the cockpit, Marcus's navigation, Lena's sensors, my own blank station, simultaneously went black. A heartbeat later, they all flickered back to life, displaying the same identical image. A live feed from the internal cockpit camera, showing my own terrified face staring back. Then, a voice filled the space, broadcast from every speaker at once. It was Lena's voice, perfect in every nuance, every tremor, and it was weeping with a grief that felt utterly, horrifyingly real. "Alex, I'm so sorry," her disembodied voice cried, the sound crackling with an artificial sorrow. "It just showed me. It showed me how it all ends. He's going to do it, Marcus. He's going to offer us to it. He's going to flood the ballast tanks and take us down. He made a deal with it last time. His life, for ours. He thinks it will finally let him go." My head whipped around to face Lena. She was right beside me, her own face a canvas of pure, violated shock. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She was shaking her head frantically, a desperate, silent denial. "It's not me, it's not me." The voice, her voice, continued its terrible, convincing performance. "You can't trust him, Alex. You can't trust what he says. But you can't trust me either. You can't trust anything you see or hear down here. It's inside the system, it's inside our heads, it's already won." The screens snapped back to their normal displays. The voice vanished. The only sound was the steady hum of the life support and the blood pounding in my ears. I was trapped between an undeniable history of betrayal on the screen, the terrified living woman beside me, and the sleeping captain who was either our last hope or our final executioner. The entity had severed our trust in technology, in our mission, and finally in each other. It had isolated each of us in a prison of absolute paranoia, and I, Alex, was now its sole, terrified warden. The fabricated sob of Lena's voice did not simply fade. It was surgically excised from the air, leaving a silence that was louder and more menacing than any alarm. The cockpit, our tiny metal sanctuary, was no longer a refuge. It had become a stage, and the entity outside was the director, puppet master, and sole audience of our final agonizing act. My reality had been hollowed out, its foundations of trust and sensory perception pulverized into a fine gray dust. I stood frozen in the space between Lena and the sleeping form of Marcus, a man caught in a triangulation of impossibilities. To my left was the living, breathing woman, whose face was a mask of violated innocence, her eyes screaming a denial her voice had just betrayed. In front of me was the captain, our shepherd, now potentially our Judas, his slumber a canvas for horrors I could only imagine, and all around us, in the humming metal, in the recycled air, in the very synapses of our brains, was the patient, pervasive presence of the thing in the trench. The vision of the whaler's final moments, the cold data of the previous doomed expeditions, Lena's terrifying vocal performance, They were no longer separate events. They were coalescing, weaving together into a single, cohesive tapestry of cosmic horror. We were not victims of a random encounter. We were the next verse in a very old, very hungry song. My mind, struggling to find purchase on a landscape of shifting certainties, began to fray. I started to see things, subtle, momentary distortions at the edge of my vision. A flicker in the reflection on a dark monitor, showing a face that was almost, but not quite, my own, its features twisted in a rictus of silent laughter. The shadow in the corner of the cockpit seemed to deepen, to coalesce for a split second into a tall, gaunt figure before dissolving back into nothingness. I would hear the faint phantom sound of a page turning, the creak of a floorboard where none existed, the distant, impossible cry of a seabird. These were not the grand theatrical assaults from before. This was a more insidious form of torture, a quiet, relentless erosion of my sanity. The entity was no longer shouting. It was whispering, not with voices, but with the quiet language of doubt, making me the unwilling architect of my own unraveling. I found myself questioning every sensation. Was the air getting colder, or was the chill emanating from the marrow of my bones? Was the hum of the scrubbers changing its pitch, or was my mind inventing new, discordant melodies? I would glance at Lena, and for a terrifying instant, her face would seem ancient, her skin thin as parchment, her eyes holding the accumulated weariness of 1,000 years. I would blink, and she would be herself again, a terrified young woman trapped in an impossible situation. Lena, too, was weathering her own silent storm. She had retreated into her work, her station becoming a fortress of logic against the rising tide of the irrational. Her focus was terrifying in its intensity. She worked with a frenzied, desperate energy, her fingers a blur across her console, her gaze locked onto her screens. She was trying to build a cage of data around the monster, to define it, to quantify it, and in doing so, to rob it of its power. But I could see the toll it was taking. Her skin was pale and translucent. Her eyes were ringed with dark, bruised circles. She would mutter to herself, dialogues with algorithms, arguments with specters on her screen. The true rot, however, was festering within Marcus. His sleep was not a rest. It was a battle. He twitched and moaned, his hands clenching and unclenching on phantom controls. His face was a contorted mask, cycling through expressions of rage, terror, and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He was not merely dreaming. He was being actively dismantled from the inside out. Once he cried out a name, Eliza, his voice thick with a grief so raw it felt like a physical wound in the quiet cockpit. The entity was not just using our memories, it was using our deepest regrets, our most painful losses, as its primary weapons. When he finally awoke, he was a different man. The disciplined, authoritative captain was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. His eyes, when they opened, were not the clear, focused eyes of a commander. They were haunted, distant, looking at a reality only he could see. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, as if his limbs were weighted down with an immense invisible burden. He didn't speak to us. He didn't acknowledge our presence. He went to the small galley and brewed a cup of coffee, his movements mechanical, automated. "Marcus," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "We need to talk. Lena found something. Files. About other missions to this spot." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the bulkhead in front of him. "Files," he repeated, the word flat, empty. "There are always files. There are always missions. It's a wheel, Alex. It just keeps turning." "What are you talking about?" I pressed, stepping closer. "What wheel? Who is Eliza?" The name struck him like a physical blow. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the metal floor plates, the dark liquid spreading like blood. His head snapped towards me, and for the first time his eyes focused on me. The raw, naked agony in them was staggering. "You have no right," he whispered, his voice trembling with a barely contained fury. "You have no right to that name. It heard you. Now it will use her. It will wear her face." "It's already using our loved ones against us, Marcus," I shot back, emboldened by his crack in composure. "It used Sarah's voice. It showed Lena her mother. We know what it's doing. But you know what it is." don't you? This isn't your first time here." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The denial, the anger, it all just evaporated. What was left was the hollowed-out shell of a man, consumed by a secret he had carried for too long. He sank onto one of the small galley benches, his head in his hands. "Project Persephone," he murmured, his voice muffled. "I was the junior pilot, the youngest member of the crew. We were a research vessel. Our mission was to study a unique gravimetric anomaly. A lie, of course. We found this place, this tomb." His voice broke. "It did to them what it's doing to us. It picked us apart, piece by piece, used our memories, our fears, turned us against each other. Aris, our chief scientist, he tried to reason with it. He thought it was a consciousness he could communicate with. He broadcast a message of peace, a sequence based on prime numbers, and it answered." "How?" Lena asked, her voice soft. She had approached, her earlier anger replaced by a grim, compassionate curiosity. Marcus looked up, his eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "It answered by showing him the heat death of the universe, projected onto the viewport. It showed him every star in the galaxy extinguishing one by one. It showed him the end of time, the final cold silence. It showed him that all his knowledge, all of human history, was less than a single grain of sand on an infinite shore." He went catatonic, never spoke another word. He shuddered, a deep, violent tremor. One by one they broke. In the end, it was just me and the captain. He made a choice. He said it was hungry, that it fed on experience, on consciousness, and that maybe, just maybe, it could be bargained with. A cold, sickening premonition washed over me. I knew what was coming. "He took the sub down, right against the hull of the structure," Marcus continued, his voice a dead monotone. "He opened a private channel. He spoke to it. He offered it a trade. The entire crew, their minds, their memories, their souls, in exchange for one survivor. One person to go back, to carry the message, to ensure the next delivery. He offered you," Lena whispered, her face ashen. Marcus finally looked at us, his face a ruin of guilt and self-loathing. It worked. I felt a release. The whispers stopped. The pressure in my mind vanished. The last thing I remember is the rest of the crew, their eyes empty, their faces slack, as the Persephone's systems were remotely hijacked and it docked with the structure. I woke up weeks later in a corporate medical facility. They told me I was the sole survivor of a catastrophic systems failure. They offered me a promotion, a command of my own. All I had to do was wait for the call. All I had to do was bring the next meal. The confession settled in the small space, a truth more monstrous than any hallucination. The corporation, the mission, the bonus, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed cage to deliver us, 3 fresh minds, to this abyssal entity. And Marcus, the man we had trusted with our lives, was the zookeeper. "So that's it?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "You just led us to the slaughter? For what? To save your own skin? You think I had a choice?" he roared, surging to his feet. The broken man replaced once more by a cornered, desperate animal. "They have my family. They have Eliza, my daughter. They made it very clear what would happen to her if I ever refused the call. Do you understand? I am doing this to save her. By sacrificing us?" Lena cried, her voice filled with horrified disbelief. "A choice has to be made," he screamed, his eyes wild. "Their lives or yours. It's a simple, brutal equation." It was then that I saw it, the shift in his eyes, the resolve hardening his features. He was no longer just confessing. He was justifying. He was preparing himself for the final act of his betrayal. He launched himself towards the helm, towards the ballast and navigation controls. I reacted on pure instinct, tackling him, my shoulder driving into his midsection. We crashed against the main console, the impact sending a shower of sparks from a shattered panel. He was stronger than me, his body hardened by years of naval discipline, his movements fueled by the ferocious energy of a desperate father. He threw me off, sending me crashing into Lena's station. Lena, however, was no longer a passive observer. She had grabbed the heaviest tool she could find, a large solid steel wrench used for manual overrides. As Marcus lunged for the controls again, she swung it with all her might, striking him across the side of the head. The sound was a sickening, wet crack that echoed in the sudden silence. Marcus crumpled to the floor, unconscious. For a moment, there was only the sound of our own ragged breathing. Then the entire submarine shuddered, a deep, violent tremor that threw us both against the bulkheads. A low, grinding sound, the protest of tortured metal, filled the air. "What was that?" I gasped, pulling myself up. Lena was already at the helm, her hands flying across the control panel Marcus had been trying to reach. "He was trying to flood the aft ballast tanks and initiate a controlled descent," she said, her voice strained. "But it wasn't him. The commands, they weren't manual. They were being entered remotely. The entity, it's in the ship's core systems." As if on cue, the lights in the cockpit flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The hum of the life support ceased. We were adrift, powerless. Then, a soft, ethereal, bioluminescent glow began to emanate from the viewport. It was coming from the structure. We scrambled to the viewport, peering out into the abyssal dark. The surface of the monolithic wreck was changing. The impossibly black material was not opening in a mechanical way. It was retracting, folding in on itself, like the iris of a colossal cosmic eye. The pupil of that eye was not a void, but an opening into a space that glowed with a soft internal luminescence, revealing impossible, swirling architectures within that defied gravity and logic. The sub, caught in some invisible gravimetric current, began to be pulled, slowly but inexorably, towards that opening. And then, a new voice spoke, not in our heads, not over the comms, but from all around us, as if the water itself had found its tongue. It was the same chorus of 1,000 voices, the same ageless, genderless tone from before, but now it held a note of finality, of imminent satisfaction. "The harvest is ready. This is the last transmission. The final entry in a log that will never be read. Marcus betrayed us. The company that hired us sacrificed us. The wreck we were sent to salvage is not a vessel. It's a snare, a sepulchre, an ancient, patient mouth. And that mouth is now opening for us." The voice we heard, the one that echoed through the very water around us, declared the harvest ready. We are the crop. I don't know what lies beyond that impossible threshold, but it feels like an ending to everything. So before we cross over, before our story becomes just another echo in this abyss, I'm asking you, whoever might be listening to this recording decades from now, what do you think the harvest is? What terrible truth waits for us in the heart of this anomaly? Leave your theories in the comments section of whatever digital archive this message ends up in, and if you have a channel of your own, subscribe to it. Hold on to it. Because out here in the final crushing silence, we have learned that stories are the only things that truly exist, and this one is about to be collected. The Triton, our coffin of steel and wires, no longer felt like it was moving through water. The sensation was not of being pulled, but of being summoned. The resistance of the ocean, the familiar drag and gentle sway, had vanished. We were caught in a current that did not obey the laws of fluid dynamics, a river of pure intention flowing from the entity. The light from the aperture was not a beam. It was a serene, internal luminescence that painted the abyssal water in shades of pearlescent, ghostly white. It was beautiful, and its beauty was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. As we neared the threshold, a profound change began to occur. The crushing pressure that had defined our existence at this depth, the immense weight of miles of ocean that should have imploded our hull in a microsecond, simply ceased to be. I felt it as a physical release, a sudden dizzying lightness in my head, as if a great weight had been lifted from my soul. The groaning of the submarine's hull fell silent. The few remaining emergency lights flickered and went out, but the interior of the cockpit was now filled with the soft, indirect glow from outside. We were crossing into another place, a realm with different rules. The final few meters of our approach were a sensory paradox. I saw the water outside thick with marine snow, but I could no longer feel its presence. Then the nose of the Triton passed through the circular opening, and reality broke. There was no splash, no breach. The water simply wasn't there. One moment our viewport was looking through an ocean. The next it was looking into a vast, dry and silent space. We had passed through the surface of a bubble that shouldn't exist, a pocket of impossibility nestled in the deepest trench on Earth. The interior was not a machine. It was a cathedral to forgotten endings. We were floating in a space of impossible scale, a vast spherical chamber whose distant curving walls were made of the same light-devouring black material as the exterior. The chamber was filled with a soft, ambient glow that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the space itself, casting no shadows, and suspended in this silent, weightless expanse were the wrecks, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, a silent, three-dimensional graveyard of maritime history. A 19th century whaling ship, its masts snapped, its timbers perfectly preserved, was frozen mid-capsize, the spectral after-image of its crew still visible on its decks. Not far from it floated a Roman trireme, its oars splintered, a ghostly centurion still clutching its helm. I saw submarines from the Second World War, their hulls eerily intact, and sleek, futuristic vessels of designs I couldn't comprehend, their metallic surfaces gleaming as if they had been launched yesterday. Each one was a perfect silent monument to its own final moment. Each one was an exhibit. And there, near the center of the vast chamber, was a research submersible, smaller than the others, its hull designation still faintly visible: Persephone. This was not a destroyer of ships. This was a collector of stories, an archivist of despair. It didn't just consume vessels. It preserved the instant of their demise, capturing the vessel, the crew, and the totality of their final, terrified experience. My dream of the whaler wasn't a hallucination. It was me accessing a file from the archive. "It's a library," Lena whispered, her voice filled with a terrible scientific awe. "A museum of extinction." As if in response to her understanding, the internal gravity of our submarine reasserted itself with a lurch. We were no longer drifting. We were resting on an unseen floor. And the process began. The first to be harvested was Marcus. He was still unconscious on the floor, a trickle of dried blood matting his hair. The soft light within the chamber seemed to coalesce around him, a gentle shimmering corona that enveloped his body. He did not stir. There was no sound, no violence. There was only a profound sense of excavation. And then the air in front of us began to shimmer, like heat haze off a summer road. An image formed, projected into the space between us and the viewport. It was a memory. His memory. A sun-drenched park. A little girl with bright red pigtails, no older than 7, laughing as she chased a kite. Eliza. The love radiating from the memory was so pure, so powerful, it was a physical force. Then another memory. Marcus, younger, in a crisp naval uniform holding the same girl as a baby, his face a portrait of absolute adoration. Then another, and another. His daughter's first day of school, her winning a swimming competition, a quiet moment of him reading her a bedtime story. We were watching the distilled essence of his love, the very core of what made him human, the motivation for his terrible betrayal. Then, the memories soured. An image of a corporate boardroom, filled with cold, smiling faces. A man in an expensive suit sliding a photograph of Eliza across the table. The unspoken threat, the chilling contract. We saw his agony during the Persephone mission, the moment he accepted the captain's horrific bargain. We watched his decade of guilt, the nightmares, the quiet desperation. We were watching his soul being unwritten, page by painful page. The projection culminated in a final, brilliant image of Eliza, smiling, her face a sunbeam. Then the image dissolved into a million points of light, which flowed like a gentle river into the glowing wall of the chamber, where they faded and were absorbed. The corona around Marcus vanished. His body remained slumped on the floor, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He was alive, but his eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and they were as empty as a windswept desert. Everything he had been, his love, his guilt, his identity, had been neatly extracted, catalogued, and filed away in the silent library. He was a book that had been read and placed back on the shelf, its pages now blank. Lena let out a choked sob, a sound of pure intellectual horror. She, who had tried to quantify the phenomenon, was now faced with an act that transcended any possible measurement. It's not killing us," she stammered, her mind struggling to categorize the atrocity. "It's unmaking us." The entity, it seemed, turned its attention to her. The shimmering light began to coalesce around her next. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. Her terror was a frozen, silent thing. She stood her ground, the scientist to the very end, observing her own deconstruction. "It's consciousness. It's not singular," she whispered, her eyes glazing over as the light intensified around her. "It's a gestalt, a chorus of every consciousness it has ever archived." Her gaze became distant, unfocused. "I can see, oh God, the patterns, the birth of a star, distilled into a single emotional concept, the collective existential terror of a hive mind on a dying world in the Andromeda galaxy, the complete architectural schematics of thought itself." Her mind, the brilliant analytical tool that had been her shield, became the conduit for her destruction. The entity did not need to rifle through her memories. It simply opened the floodgates of its own. It poured an eternity of knowledge, the experiences of a billion lives and a million dying worlds, directly into her finite human consciousness. Her face, which had been a mask of terror, went slack. An expression of profound, ecstatic, and ultimately empty understanding dawned on her features. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It's all so simple," she breathed. Then her light too was gone. Her body remained standing for a moment, a statue of enlightened catatonia, before she slowly crumpled to the floor, her eyes as vacant as Marcus's. And then it was my turn. The light gathered around me. It was not cold, not hot. It was nothing. I did not fight. I did not scream. What was the point? You cannot fight a library. You cannot punch an archive. My terror was replaced by a vast, cold, and strangely peaceful despair. I had reached the end of the story. It did not begin with grand visions. It began intimately. It found the memory of my wife, Sarah, on our wedding day. It lifted the memory from me, not tearing it, but gently, respectfully, like a curator lifting a priceless artifact. I felt the memory leave me. I did not forget it. Rather, I became aware of its absence. A perfectly shaped hole was left in my mind where that joy had once resided. I could still access the data. I married a woman named Sarah, but the emotion, the warmth, the smell of her perfume, the feel of her hand in mine was gone. It was a fact without a soul. It took another memory. The birth of our son. The overwhelming, crushing love I felt when I held him for the first time. The memory was siphoned away, and another piece of my foundation turned to dust. It took my childhood, my triumphs, my failures, my secret shames, my quiet hopes. It took the taste of coffee, the feeling of sunlight on my skin, the sound of rain against a window pane. My entire life, my identity, was being carefully and methodically dismantled, distilled into pure experience to be filed and stored forever. The last thing to go was my love for Sarah, the very last anchor of my soul. I felt it being drawn out, a long, shimmering thread of light, and as it left me, I was granted one final, terrible understanding. The entity was not evil. It was not malicious. It was a collector. It was utterly, terrifyingly indifferent. In a universe of fleeting moments and dying stars, it had found the one thing of permanence, the story, and we were now a part of its endless collection. My body, this shell, is still alive. The Triton systems came back online a short while ago. The entity, its harvest complete, released us. The aperture sealed, and our small submersible is now ascending, a silent, automated ghost rising from the depths. They will find us. The recovery crews will open the hatch and find 3 living, breathing, but fundamentally empty human beings. They will call it a mystery, a new form of deep-sea psychosis. They will write papers, and our names will become a footnote in the annals of unexplained phenomena. They will be wrong. It is not a mystery. We were hired for a deep-sea salvage operation. The truth we discovered is that the most valuable thing in the universe is a story. And the wreck we found. It wasn't the thing being salvaged, it was us.